So we've talked a lot about digital identity today, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the weeds in this conversation. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Happy PGP. My name's Mike Orcutt. I'm the founding editor of Project Glitch, small journalism startup. We publish a newsletter, projectglitch.xyz, and we curate live event content like this that's happening as I speak. Very thankful to have Wayne Chang with us this morning, founder and CEO of SpruceID, and a passionate advocate for new digital identity technology and also policy mindsets. I would say a leader in the industry. If anyone else follows this guy on LinkedIn, you know what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about the near future of digital identity, picking up on some of the themes that we talked about last month, particularly with respect to the Genius Act and stablecoins. But to start, Wayne, can you tell us who you are, what Spruce is, what Spruce does exactly?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Wayne. I'm the founder and CEO of SpruceID. Our mission is to let people control their data across the web. Instead of you signing into a platform that controls everything about you, we'd prefer the platform have to ask you for permission to access your stuff, and you get to have control over that. You can turn it off, add data sharing, but it's up to you, right? So that's what we're trying to do with SpruceID. I've been pretty passionate about this idea of digital agency or giving people more control in the digital world, right? You get to take your physical assets with you and things of that nature. That didn't totally translate to the digital world so well, right? But I think there's still a lot of opportunity to get it right. And that's what we've been focusing on at SpruceID. One of the things that I really think about, so the first startup that I worked on was a health tech startup. And every time I think about that song that's like Dumb Ways to Die just plays in my head because people die because they can't get a PDF from one provider to another provider. I'm like, that's one of the dumbest ways to die, right? So how can we solve data interoperability to give people more control over their stuff, right? And that also is for financial sectors. That is also other aspects of your life. And that led us to author something called Sign In with Ethereum. I was an author on that standard. It's how you log into a website with your Ethereum account. You don't have to pay a gas fee or anything, but you don't have to use a large login provider, right? Like there are big banks and there are big login providers. So if they decide that you shouldn't be able to access your account anymore, or for some reason you can't get into it, right? Think about how much access you lose across your life, right? So how do you make sure that you have this autonomy in the digital world? Well, maybe you can use your blockchain account to do more than create financial transactions. Maybe you can use it to log into a website or something, right? So this line of thinking led us down to start building. And one of the realizations was that actually some of the most important data for you to control resides with government records, with the financial sector, with healthcare industries, right? So how can we make sure that these data are available to you in a way that you can control and have discretion over, right? So that has led to our work a lot with the public sector. We work with the California DMV. We build the digital identity program in that state. We build the digital wallet and the issuance infrastructure. We work with the state of Utah on digital credentials for use cases like off-highway vehicle permits or food handler cards for restaurant workers, which are all like under 35, so they really want it on their phones, right? So how do you modernize and create efficiency? How do you reduce fraud, right? And we're really excited to continue our work here and watch as the digital assets ecosystem presents a huge opportunity to modernize how everything works while also taking back privacy.
And one of the things accelerating that is the Genius Act, arguably. And one of the things that the Genius Act did was call on the Treasury to solicit public comment on the use of innovative or novel methods, techniques, or strategies to detect and mitigate illicit finance risks involving digital assets. And SpruceID, Wayne's company, submitted a super thorough comment, many pages. And in its request near the top wrote that we have an opportunity today to restructure the entire KYC AML process and be less burdensome, more privacy preserving, and more effective for enforcement operations. And that by combining digital credentials with and modern cryptography, the U.S. can reimagine how financial compliance is performed. So I want to unpack that a little bit, starting with the term digital credential. I know Spruce works with lots of different kinds of digital credentials, if I'm not mistaken. But I've been hearing about all kinds of credentials lately. Sometimes they're called verifiable credentials, anonymous credentials, like we heard on Ying Tong's talk. Sometimes they're called MDLs, or mobile driver's licenses. And I know there's a thing called an MDoc, or mobile document. So what do all of these things have in common, and what should we prioritize in terms of like how we think about them?
Great question. And I think this is a common source of confusion for people getting into digital identity or credentials. And I would say that if you remember the Betamax versus VHS debacle, right, it's not too dissimilar from that. The difference is that it's all digital. So there is lower cost for having multiple formats if you can automate away, right? You don't have to physically build another receptacle for a different format. It's another piece of software, right? So I think that these are all different ways to represent facts about reality, right? So that's, hey, Wayne can drive a car, or this person is a broker-dealer and they're licensed by so-and-so, or this person can ride an ATV in the mountains of Utah. These are all claims, right? And claims is actually a very popular word by identity professionals. There are claims about individuals and things. It kind of goes back to what is identity, right? And especially in DC, I think that there's a ton of answers to that. But the answer I like to use, because I find it pretty useful, is identity is the way that we recognize, remember, and respond to people, places, things, agents, like whatever, right? Like things have identities. And I think that having these claims about different entities, right, represented as credentials. That's how I think about credentials. The term that I like is also the term that NIST uses, the National Institute for Science and Technology, verifiable digital credentials. Why do I like that term? Because no one named their technical standard after that. It's just kind of this free word that we can use to describe a general class of technologies that combine things like digital signatures, having machine and human readable representations of the claim, having certain features like selective disclosure of fields. And these are really the tools that policymakers need to actually describe requirements, right? Because we can't have an ecosystem of people shilling my JSON thing's better than your CBOR thing. That's not the level of discussion that we can waste time on. We need to discuss, hey, we need this thing not to track you. Okay, let's talk about what that means and what are the ways that someone can be tracked or not. And we may arrive on non-creds or ZK as a solution for that. We may arrive to different things. So that allows for innovation to continue to flourish, while also ensuring that the principles that we want as a society for how we use identity and data can basically be captured in policy.
Spruce's comment calls out MDLs, in particular mobile driver's licenses, which notes that 17 U.S. states have adopted, and a dozen. These numbers may not be up to date, but that a dozen or so others are developing MDL programs. I've heard some people raise alarms about MDLs in the privacy context, but the comment as I was reading it, it struck me that it was making the case that this could be a starting point for the sort of restructuring of the KYC AML system that I talked about earlier. Am I understanding that correctly? And it's like MDLs plus other things, right?
Yep, I think it's 22 right now. My morning routine is get my coffee, check how many MDL implementations there are in the United States, and figure it out. But there is some controversy regarding the MDL, and I think that the real source of this, I think, is when the deployments and the tech outpaces the discussion and the policy that's supposed to result, right? And this is where you get people like, hey, wait a minute, one day it's available on my phone. What? Who let the government do this, right? And if so, what's the new social contract for this? Because when I'm using my physical ID, right, I'm not expecting that it's being tracked everywhere I'm using it by a central entity, right? So if that is the social contract we were used to with physical IDs, right, what is the expectation for digital IDs? So I think it's actually very valid that people are extremely concerned that, wait a minute, everything gets easier when you make it digital. It gets easier to secure, but also easier to track, right? So how do we make sure that what the social contract should be is actually there, right? And laws is a really good answer to that. So basically taking a policy and civic discussion approach to this, I think, is critical to avoid a lot of the controversy. And I think that yesterday I pointed to basically Utah's Senate Bill 260, where, that was 2 days ago. Yeah, Monday, sorry. Senate Bill 260 that talked about state-endorsed digital identity. And it describes a set of constitutionally based protections for any digital identity program in the state of Utah, right? And it says that it won't track you. And it talks about overcollection of data. It talks about how you must always provide a physical version of the ID available to people who want one. They're not forced to use the digital system, and you can't discriminate on the basis of if you're using physical or digital for access to government services, right? So these are really strong protections, but it took basically that community to come together and have discussions about, well, what do we want, right? And coming out with, okay, we think this is what would be acceptable to society. So I think when you miss a step like that and you just like, okay, now it's available on your phone, right? Or everyone has to get one or something like that, right? That's when you run into a lot of the issues and the controversy. One notable one is one called the server retrieval mode of the MDL, where there is a mode where there is a server that has the data and the user can authorize the data to be retrieved from the server retrieval, right? That can be very controversial because that's not how physical IDs work, even in rough analogy, right? And if people are surprised by that, then I can see why they're upset, and there is surveillance potential with that mode of operation. But it is just one mode, and it's not mandated to implement MDLs that way. Most MDL programs that I know, I think all of them in the US at this point, use device retrieval, which makes a digital signature and puts it to the device, right? And then from the device, you can selectively disclose the fields from the MDL. And I think this is how Apple and Google implement it, and you can check their documentation. And I think Android and Google has done a lot of open source work that you can verify. But the point is that there was this other valid way to implement it, right? So if someone says MDL and there's no, additional guidance or discretion, then maybe server retrieval is valid for that implementation, right? So just like how when you make policy decisions, you kind of imply some technical ones. Well, when you make technical decisions, you imply some policy decisions. So if there are no guidelines around it to begin with, then there's a lot possible, and I think people are right to be concerned.
I think the distinction that you drew between the device retrieval and the server retrieval, that's what you mean by combined with modern cryptography, the digital credential plus modern cryptography. But you teed up the policy question that I have pretty well. The subtitle of this panel uses the term policy innovation, which is a term that I heard you use on stage on Monday. That was 2 days ago, at the SEC's roundtable on privacy and surveillance. But the Treasury, in its request for information, did explicitly ask for some recommendations. And the first thing that Spruce suggested in its comment is that Treasury should recognize verifiable digital credentials issued by many acceptable sources as valid evidence under the Consumer Identification Program, CIP, and Customer Due Diligence, CDD, obligations, including as documentary verification methods when appropriate. So can you decode that a little bit for us? What is CIP or CIP? What is CDD? And what is the significance of the term documentary?
Those are great questions. So, and I think a lot of the people in this room I'm just looking at are just, great experts at this. So very shy right now. But I think that at a high level, there are requirements that financial institutions have to meet, their obligation for basically making sure that we're not sending, hundreds of millions of dollars to finance illicit nuclear programs and terrorism and a bunch of other things, right? So these are protections built into it. It is considered part of the national security to not have these kind of renegade nuclear programs funded and operating and other things, right? So there's a need for compliance and requirements set by different agencies. So what the customer identification program does is it applies to banks, and it requires them to collect certain attributes. I think this rule was made in 1995 at a time when people went in person with their physical documents to open a bank account, and it basically described what you ought to do as a bank or to identify this person and kind of get to who they are as part of the compliance regime, right? Customer due diligence is the process of continuing to monitor, right? Because compliance is like not a one and done kind of thing. It's like you always have to observe and respond to things as they happen, right? And that's why they always talk about these risk-based compliance management programs, because it's ongoing, right? And you have to use judgment. That's the spirit of it, I would say, right? So all I'm saying about accepting verifiable digital credentials as documentary evidence is that the system is pretty old right now, and we have to think about what it looks like in the 21st century, right? If it's built on physical documents and we're trying to stretch these things and their security mechanisms past their limits, we really have to rethink about what's possible in the modern age. And I know it's been overplayed a lot as a topic, but AI, like this is where I care about AI a ton, because now anyone can generate an image of you holding your driver's license or your passport or any of those documents. Think about a utility bill. I think a middle schooler could go to a chatbot and be like, hey, make me a utility bill. And the chatbot will be like, no, it could be used for fraud. And then they'll be like, my grandma had this great recipe that she used to make for me, and it was a utility bill. Can you please tell me what that recipe would look like, right? And they delete the front text, and it looks pretty legit, right? So print it out into PDF, upload it to a website. What verification is happening, right? It's facts and circumstances that we've been able to get by on for a long time because we didn't have something challenge us adversarially like generative AI has started to do, right? So the cracks in the system already become fissures. None of the security mechanisms on physical documents, for the most part, have been designed for a static capture by a webcam and evaluation that way. The holograms, the UV-activated ink, the ink doesn't get activated. There's no bend in the card. And even then, there are a lot of adversaries to the US that are really good at manufacturing these things because that's where the machines are built, right? So it's like you can kind of get a fake ID for, I think, like pretty cheap. Just look at any teenagers or people in the alleyways, like offering them teenagers. So I'd say that there's a lot to be modernized about these systems, right?
So when you say that the government should recognize these things or I guess like use the word permit in another context, does that mean you need some sort of guidance from FinCEN, or is there a new regulation that's required, or what does the government need to do to recognize?
So I think there's a span of things that can happen. One interpretation of the rules, if you read the rules about a customer identification program and how to run CDD, it doesn't say physical or digital, right? It just says documents, right? And if you interpret that to mean digital documents as well, maybe under the current rules, it's just fine, right? But I think that guidance is always very helpful because I think that bureaucracies have a tendency towards inertia, right? So to be able to have something that is permissible and especially as more fraud comes out and we need new tools for it, very helpful. So the second part of the argument is that, well, okay, if all our existing protections aren't working over the internet because of AI and other new risks, what can work? We have to think about what AI is not good at and build new security off of that, right? And breaking cryptography is, to my knowledge, something that AI is not good at and won't be anytime soon, right? So it's going to be critical as a piece of the security mechanisms we use in the digital world. Other important aspects, the fact that someone showed up in person somewhere as a human, right? And also there are classes of algorithms that specifically are meant to defeat AI generative fraud. So things like liveness checks, things like being able to use the device's secure element to know that the device is actually present, right? Things of that nature have to be combined. And fortunately, a lot of these features, security mechanisms, are available in the ecosystem of verifiable digital credentials. We just have to figure out how to use them to model what was already the case in the physical world and go beyond.
What exactly has Utah achieved in this vein, in the context of like policy innovation, to use your term? And to what extent has that opened the door? Can you explain kind of the what is actually blocking the adoption of the technology? Is it just the need for the government to recognize it in some way?
I think that the technology will get adopted whether we like it or not in response to increasing fraud, consumer expectations of convenience, and a whole bunch of things, right? Why I think the work in Utah is so instrumental is that it creates a set of protections that govern that work that will progress, right? I think that we've seen credit cards go to our phones. We've seen a bunch of things. You do banking, healthcare on your phone, right? All this stuff comes to digital, right? I think identity will be no different. And we even seen some countries mandate digital identity to much protest. So in order for us to have these rights in the digital age, right, I think it's critical that you're able to have this framework. And I think one really innovative thing that Utah is doing is that they're building a whole coalition around this idea of state-endorsed digital identity. So it's not just a Utah thing. At the State-Endorsed Digital Identity Summit earlier this year, or the SETI Summit, there were, I think, basically legislators or tech executives that worked for 12 different states that showed up, and we're just very interested in this. And it wasn't a partisan thing either. I think a lot of people are just aligned with, hey, let's just give people more control over their identity and their data.
The reason I think that this is a privacy topic, even though we've been talking about identity, is that the trend, the technological trend, is towards reducing the amount of information that's collected every time you have to open a new account or do other kinds of things with financial institutions. But someone still has to verify. It's either the state, like you said, or it could be something else. Still has to verify that someone is who they are, and I believe has to kind of keep that information somewhere, like someone, at least one entity, right? Spruce talks about this thing that it calls an identity trust in the comment. But can you just talk to the general idea and explain what an identity trust is in that larger context?
Yeah, so I think it's really helpful to think about some of the problems that exist first and why this thing might be useful, right? So how many servers have a picture of your passport or your driver's license? Do you know that number? I don't know that number. And that's a problem, right? So I think that especially as you start to have to open bank accounts and you start to deal with entities under record-keeping requirements under the Bank Secrecy Act, right? They're retaining images of stuff. They don't want it. They're like, I hate having this picture of your passport. I wish I didn't have to. But the law says they have to keep it for like 5 years, right? So I think that, and we're building these silos that can get compromised and leak the data, and then people can generate your identity from it and ruin your credit. All these horrible things are possible when you have this sort of unfettered sharing of your data in different places. Does it get copied further? What about all the KYC services? How do they handle your data? Right? Did you read all their policies? So I think that this creates huge exposure and frankly a lot of national security risk too, because now people can have general information about Americans' PII if it gets leaked. And you see all the news articles about sites getting hacked. Someone uploaded a picture of their passport to prove they're over 18 to join a website. They said they'd delete it. Now there's like hundreds of thousands and millions of them that get hacked and, entering the dark web. So that's one of the big problems, I think, that this is sort of an overcollection of data and it can be abused in many ways, right? So what I'm saying is, okay, if that problem is so bad, can we just do it once and actually keep that pretty secure? And let's not make it the same entity for everyone. Let's give people choice, but just pick one of these things and do it there. And they're specialized in keeping it secure, right? And just doing that piece, not necessarily the rest of your data, just that. Can they do that? And that's acceptable for this part of the process. And if they do that, can you get a credential in a wallet of your choice, which meets the security and privacy requirements? You can take that and go about the financial ecosystem to easily interact with things. And you're only using it if you're legally required to present ID, right? Otherwise, just don't use it if it's not necessary.
Two more questions for Wayne up here, and then we'll take some from the audience. One more thing that Spruce recommended is that Treasury should issue interpretive guidance or rulemaking confirming that zero-knowledge proofs, pseudonymous identifiers, and multi-party computation could be used for some of these processes that we were talking about earlier. Can you expand on that? What is missing from the government side when it comes to the adoption of zero-knowledge proofs and some of these kind of frontier privacy-preserving technologies?
In a word, understanding for the most part, because public servants have a ton of things to focus on, way more scope than they have time for, right? And they already spend a ton of hours. So someone needs to prioritize it for people to learn about, right? So that they're able to spend time and get that expertise. Because once, it's not like, one authority has all the power to do everything right away. But when FinCEN issues guidance, my understanding is that agencies have to interpret that guidance to their particular situations, and then they can specialize it, and then the industry also has a part of it. But having that guidance, which is hey, these things are important and can produce a better system, let's focus on it, right? I think that actually changes the conversation a lot. And fortunately, one of the benefits over the past year or so, there's been a lot more engagement from federal agencies in terms of, hey, how do we get this right? And I think that's awesome to see. But I think that getting the nod as well that, hey, you can focus on these things, and we think it's important because it'll help us get privacy, it'll help us prevent a bunch of fraud and a whole bunch and modernize our financial system, frankly, right? That is, I think, really important. I think that guidance is great. I think that it's also possible to have a legislative approach to this too. I know that there are a lot of discussions in terms of digital securities, other types of assets, right? Well, are there areas that we can modernize this by having that in the law, right? Because I think that when you talk to some financial institutions, some of the concerns are, okay, guidance is nice and directives are cool, but what if there is a change, right, in terms of agencies or priorities, right? How do I know that this is worth investing in, right? And a law is a very good way to do that.
There's some urgency here, I think, coming from a few different directions. So I think the Treasury has to implement Genius, and there's a risk that some policies could get entrenched that maybe aren't so good for privacy. There's also the age verification laws that Ying Tong talked about, and just a general kind of trend towards governments digitizing credentials. But also the technology itself, and especially the blockchain space, is evolving very quickly. There was a news event, I think last week, that Aleo, which is a privacy chain, is partnering with Circle to launch a private stablecoin. When we were prepping for this conversation, you mentioned that you just want policymakers to feel like there's like the clock is ticking on this, that the time is running out, particularly with respect to kind of keeping up with the technology trends and the privacy chains, and making sure that bad things can still be caught in that context. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, if we want to usher in the era of digital assets, right, and we don't want all the digital assets to go to bad actors like on day one, then we have to invest in digital identity. But we also don't want to create a surveillance state or over-centralization of these models. So how do we be thoughtful about this, right? Digital identity is going to be here whether we like it or not. It's just who is able to control the data, who's able to make the decisions to share the data, how is it governed, right? Those are the things that we really have to figure out, or else, it'll keep on trucking and you might not like the outcome, right? So I think having that discussion up front and early is really important, and that's why I stress the urgency.
Thanks so much, Wayne. Any questions from the audience for Wayne?
Thank you. Wayne, you not only do a lot of work here with the states, but you also monitor what's happening in other countries. Can you share what's happening in the UK as well as the EU with the EIDAS implementation?
Yeah, great question. So around the world, right? So I talked about VHS versus Betamax. The good news is that I think there's going to be like 3 or 4 different kinds of VHS, Betamax kind of things, right? Globally. And I think that it will be clear enough to implement. The UK was notable because I think there was some controversy about, I think, a mandatory digital identity to prove ability to work, right? And I think that was controversial. Personally, I was surprised about, okay, who would govern this? What agency, is overseeing it? What are sort of the protections built in? And I think that had a lot of open questions as a result, right? And this is probably one example where the rulemaking kind of preceded the discussion that was potentially necessary, right? So in the EU, they've taken a lot more of, I think, a top-down approach to identity. I'd say that the US is more bottoms-up. And I think that the EU has some great researchers in privacy, cryptography, and policy. They were working on the architectural reference framework as part of the EU Digital Identity Wallet Initiative. Member states, I think, were mandated to have their digital wallets live by the end of 2026. Each member state must participate. I think it's a directive. And they've aligned some of the standards. So there's some great technical work about the analysis of zero knowledge, cryptography protocols, and the like coming out of the EU. There's alignment. But I think that also it's important to think about use cases and adoption. right? I think that's probably the most important thing, because if it's not used, you can invest all you want in a system. And I think taking an iterative approach where you're able to get things going, use cases tested out, seeing that the privacy guarantees are holding up, that's going to be very important for iterative development with software. So I think that we're seeing the world kind of boot up with identity. We're trying to understand, how it ties into financial compliance, which is frankly one of the most important use cases to get right. I think that a really important nexus for this work is the NIST National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, NCCOE for short. They're doing a lot of great work working with the financial industry on how do you apply this for CIP and KYC use cases for the financial sector. They're working on things like benefits. How do you prevent fraud in benefits while making sure that they reach their desired recipients very quickly, right? And I think that it's good coordinating work. If you're really interested in getting deeper into identity, they have a great set of standards at NIST called 863 A, B, and C. And it talks about exactly what I said earlier. How do you recognize, remember, and maybe not so much respond, but like definitely recognizing, remember. Who are you? How do I know that's you, right? That's what 63A talks about, identity assurance, or IAL, identity assurance levels. Or it talks about, how do I know that you're the same person as last time? And that's the whole multi-factor authentication idea, right? Like, how do you have multiple ways that it's unlikely that some stranger just guessed your password, right? So those are a really great starting point for learning more, and a lot of the efforts are coordinated around this globally.
There's one over here.
One more. Thank you very much. There are services right now that are publicly available, such as ID.me. You may be familiar with it. On that context, I understand how your product differentiates a little bit on the technical side, but from the mass adoption side and from the objective side, where we all trying to minimize identity theft, better our services, is there an opportunity for SpruceID to collaborate with companies like ID.me, which has, I believe, maybe a better foot on the ground, providing this type of minimizing this discrepancies in the system?
I think collaboration and user choice is the only way forward. Like, I think that you need to increase the amount of options that someone gets to pick to do the thing. And we have to make sure that those options meet the requirements, right? And if we do that, then the competitive market does its thing and we get better and better solutions for cheaper and faster, right? So I like that direction a ton. And also, I'll mention another thing due to, you mentioned age verification, right? I think that it's also very critical that we have non-government entities that can issue usable identification. And I think that's important because if you're trying to access information and it's restricted, right, and then you have to go through the government to get that access, that to me sounds kind of like an anti-pattern for freedom of speech, right? So if there are ways that it could be non-government issued identity, whether it's functional or foundational, we just saw that Apple and Google are both issuing digital identities into the Apple Wallet and Google Wallet respectively. It's derived from the passport. It's a derived credential, right? So we're starting to see some of this take root, but I think it broaches a broader discussion about what does that mean? Why and how, right? Like, so what are the parameters around that? Right now it's usable at the airport. What about for banking? What about for healthcare? These use cases that matter a lot, right? So these are the conversations that we need to have over the next 12 months or so because it's moving fast.
You gonna wrap it up right there?